Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Frank King. He's a TEDx speaker. He speaks on suicide prevention. He's a motivational speaker. And I suspect he has a pretty strong sense of humor, which will come into play and hopefully work out. Frank, thanks for coming.
My pleasure, yes.
Tell me about a little bit about your background and history. How did you get into speaking? And in one hand, it's very humorous, but then also it seems like you talk about suicide prevention, so that's very serious. But tell me a bit about your background, if you would.
Well, I told my first joke in the fourth grade. Students laughed. The teacher was so hysterical, she had to excuse herself to go to the teacher's lounge. And I thought, I'm going to be a stand-up comedian. In 12th grade, they had a talent show, and nobody had ever done stand-up before. So I signed up and won. And I told my mother I was going to be a stand-up comedian, and she was big into education. She goes, "No, son, you're going to college. I don't care what you do when you get done. You can be a goat herder for all I care, but you're going to be a goat herder with a college degree." Went to school at Chapel Hill, got a couple of college degrees, and moved with my high school sweetheart / first wife to San Diego, California. And there's a comedy store in San Diego, a branch of the famous one up on Sunset. And they had open mic nights, and that was the beginning of the end of my insurance career and the beginning of the end of my first marriage, because she was foursquare against me doing comedy. So then went on the road. And then when I came off the road, mid-'90s, the comedy club thing was kind of burned out. And so I became a corporate comedian. And for about 10 years, till 2007 or 8, the last recession, I did good, clean stand-up comedy at conferences after dinner, after lunch. And then with the recession, we lost everything in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and that's when I learned what the barrel of my gun tasted like. Yeah, spoiler alert, I did not pull the trigger. And a friend of mine came up to me after one of my keynotes. He'd never heard me say the phrase, I didn't pull the trigger. And he goes, "Hey, man, how come you didn't pull the trigger?" I go, "Hey, man, because you tried to sound slightly less disappointed." That's the comedy.
Social ignorance.
Yeah, that's the comedy comes with suicide. So after the recession, when the speaking business came back, the meeting planner said, "Frank, we love you. We can't pay you just to be funny. I'm sorry. You had to teach us something it wasn't a world of teaching anybody." And then I started thinking about my mental health history and my family. It's all genetic, more nuts in my family than in a squirrel turd. And I thought I could talk about suicide prevention, tell my story. And so I got some training I've taken several courses in suicide prevention, so that when somebody comes to one of my keynotes, I teach them how to spot the signs of depression, thoughts of suicide, what to do and say, kind of thing. So that's when I made the jump from funny speaker to speaker who is funny. And somebody asked me, "Does it keep you from getting booked as a suicide prevention speaker because you're a comedian?" I said, "No, you got it backwards. They want the story. They want the learning objectives, teach them something. And the fact that I can give them a little comic relief along the way, makes it much more palatable, easier to digest all that serious.
Yeah,
So,
no, it's very interesting. It seems like your life is like a series of opposites or dichotomies. You're selling insurance, but you're doing comedy, which sounds the opposite to me. You're working in corporate America, but doing comedy, which there doesn't seem to be much comedy there.
No.
And then suicide mixed with comedy. So it's, a very interesting dichotomy. So if you would, tell me a bit about your past situation. Like, how did it get to the point where how did you make a decision? Like, you were going to end things, and what were some of the nuances of that situation?
The speaking business dropped off about 80%, and we had a big mortgage payment, even though we put half down on the farm we were living on. Big mortgage payment. We had a rental property, negative cash flow. So I was upside down on everything. And when you cut the income by 80%, I used all my credit lines and all my credit cards, maxed all this out, thinking this will pass. So I got to the point where I called one of those nonprofit credit counselors, and they said, Frank, look, it's time to pull the plug. It's not like you're buying ski-doos and Coke. Sea-doos and Coke, you were, flat screen TVs, you were just trying to live. So there's no shame or moral issue. You just can't make your payments. So we filed Chapter 7, broke my wife's heart, which was killing me. And then I realized, wait a minute, I got $1 million life insurance policy. If I kill myself, my wife will be restored instantly financially. She'll be brokenhearted, but she certainly won't be broke. She can stay on the farm and, bank the rest of the money. And so what held me up was having sold insurance, life insurance in particular. I knew my $1 million life insurance policy had a 2-year suicide clause, meaning if I kill myself in less than 24 months, then they would just return the premiums. They wouldn't pay the death benefit. So I called my insurance agent, and sure enough, I'd only had the policy 22 months. I had to wait 60 days to kill myself, which is not a problem for me because I have a mental illness called chronic suicidal ideation, meaning suicide is an option on the menu always as a solution for problems large and small. My car broke down a couple of years ago. I had 3 thoughts: get it fixed, buy a new one, or I could just kill myself. That's the way my brain works. So waiting 2 months, that's what happened when I made the jump to comedy. I've got a TED Talk called Suicide, the Secret of My Success, because I realized, even though it was a lovely woman that I married, my first wife, I was miserable. I was selling insurance for her father's company because that's what she wanted me to do, and I was miserable. And I wasn't going to open mic night, which is where I thought I belonged. And I realized if I don't change something, I'm going to kill myself sooner rather than later. So my second thought was, well, wait a minute. I could divorce my wife, quit my job, try comedy. If it works, great. If it doesn't, I can still kill myself. And like most mentally ill people, I figured I was the only one who ever had those thoughts. And I've met half a dozen entertainers and entrepreneurs, same basic thought process. This is not my life. I don't belong here. I belong over there. And if I don't go, I'm going to kill myself. So what the heck? Put it all on one roll of the dice.
When did you first start experiencing the idea of, thinking suicide was an option? And how did you figure out that this was a persistent thing or a named condition? Or, just tell me a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, my first thought was suicide. I've been depressed off and on when I started college, but I just thought because my first wife eventually and I were going to colleges a great distance apart, and I thought I was just, it's just puppy love, and I was heartbroken because we weren't together. Looking back, that was probably the beginning of my depression. And then a couple of years into the marriage, when I realized wrong woman, wrong job, that was when I had my first thought of, well, you can just kill yourself. It's just the way it's like a friend of mine describes it. It's like one of those little planes with a banner on the back that flies over the stadium with a message on the banner. The plane goes through your mind, and then the banner says, well, why don't you just kill yourself? It just comes out of nowhere and disappears, but it's always there. So I made the change. Because I knew if I didn't make a change, I was going to kill myself. So I made the change to stand-up comedy. And fortunately, it worked. I thought it would. And matter of fact, first night on stage, middle of my 5 minutes, inside my head, I heard a little voice say, "You're home." Oh, okay. And it's only happened 3 times in my life where I, unbidden, that thought bubbled up, "You're home." So I knew I was in the right place. If I'd known how hard it was to make a living doing stand-up, I might have hesitated a bit, but I didn't know. I had no idea.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit FindingGeniusPodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit FindingGeniusPodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
So you just jumped in and tried it, and what happened?
I jumped in. I started open mics on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1984. And then in the fall of 95, the Improv had come to town. They opened a comedy club, San Diego Improv. They had a funniest person in San Diego contest, and I won. I got $1,000 and a lot of publicity that I could use to promote myself on the road. And I asked my girlfriend, now my wife of 34 years, I asked her, I said, hey, I'm going on the road to be a stand-up comedian. You want to come along? Thinking she'd go, oh, hell no. And she goes, yeah. So we gave up the apartment, our jobs, jumped into my teeny tiny Dodge Colt and took off across the country and didn't have a home for over 7.5 years. And I opened up, worked with Seinfeld, Dennis Miller, and Jeff Foxworthy, and Ron White, Adam Sandler, Kevin James, Dr. Ken, back when they were just comics.
That's cool. So what kind of insights did you get, by the way? I know we're kind of going a little off topic, but what's the industry like, and what are the people like in the industry, the comedians?
Well, the ones who actually launch and escape gravity and become famous, like Dr. Ken, he was an open micer when I was in Raleigh working at a radio station and emceeing the open mic night at the comedy club. Dr. Ken was in medical school at Duke, and he would come over on amateur nights and perform. And he was, you can often tell, it wasn't spectacularly funny off the top or at the beginning, but you can tell there's comedy there. And once he hits his stride, and of course now he's huge and, in the Hangover movies and movies in general in LA. So the 30 comics I started with, 30-ish in San Diego, problem for a lot of them was they were funnier than I am, but they didn't have any business sense. I had stationery and envelopes and business cards, and it was a business. And that's what insurance taught me. And I knew how to ask for referrals. So I was treating it like a business. Most of those guys and gals, it was just a rolling cocktail party, because you get free or inexpensive drinks if you're a comedian working the show. And for me, it wasn't that. It was a business, and I was gonna make my living doing it. And I've had to reinvent myself several times, from road comic to radio personality to corporate comic, and now corporate speaker. So I've had a number of iterations of Frank King in my career.
It seems like a corporate comic is like an oxymoron. What was that like, by the way?
Yeah, I think everybody should hire a corporate comic because we're truth tellers. We observe and then we report. And I was talking to a guy the other day who has, and I've done this myself, he went in to interview the managers of all the departments before he did the comedy show. And he used some of what he learned from the managers. And he said, they all said the same thing. They all had the same complaints about the same people, in the upper echelon, but they never tell anybody. It's just bar talk. He said they complain and bitch and moan, but never to the people in the C-suite. And so he did a little bit of that, used a little bit of that information in his act, specifically to point out, look, everybody's talking about this outside the building, and it's the elephant in the room. And so I'm gonna pull back the curtain and show you who the elephant is. So yeah, but corporate comedy, the thing about corporate comedy is, and a lot of comics don't realize this, there's much more money in clean comedy because you can do it on cruise ships, corporate events, colleges. And so HR usually hires the comedian. And a woman said to me, we're paying you $5,000 for 45 minutes of just jokes. And I said, no, you're paying me $5,000, not for the 45 minutes of jokes I tell, for the 45 minutes of jokes I don't tell. And I said, you're paying me basically, so when I get done with my job, you still have a job. You put a microphone in a comic's hand, they can do a lot of damage in a very short period of time.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
I don't know, anything from the corporate comedy that, taught you a lot of, they taught you important lessons? Like, what did you get out of doing it?
Well, that people will pay a lot of money to keep their job. That in terms of supply and demand, there are far fewer clean comics, And there are far more conferences and conventions than there will ever be comedy clubs. I mean, there's conferences and conventions in every major city every day. So it's a much bigger market. And then the transition from comedian to speaker, what I learned there is that if you can give them the comedy and a message, something to take away, some action items or whatever, they'll pay you even more money. But the key was rebranding from a funny speaker to a speaker who is funny, because I've been funny for a couple of decades. And so how do you convince meeting planners and speakers bureaus you can do something serious? Well, I thought I'll do a TED Talk and I'll come out as depressed and suicidal and talk about shoving a gun in my mouth. That should prove to them that I can. And it did. It worked. And then I've done 5 more since then, all on mental health topics to reinforce. I guess what I learned there was branding is very important. You need to become a brand so that eventually when somebody's looking for a mental health or suicide prevention speaker, they're not looking for anybody. They're looking for you. That's what you're trying over the long term. And I believe I learned you have to pick a lane. When you're a comedian, you pick a lane of either clean comedy or dirty comedy, because there are markets for each. It's the one in the middle, well, he's sort of dirty, no work. Because, dirty, you can do cable. Clean, you can do corporate events, cruise ships, colleges. So you need to pick a lane. That's something. And you have to pick a point of view as a comedian. That's very funny, Frank. All those things are very funny. But what's your point of view? Who are you? I want to watch your comedy show and figure out who you are, is a lesson that I learned. There's a show called Crashing, about a comic who, very religious background, goes to New York, tries to become a comedian, and he's sleeping on people's couches. That's why they call it crashing. Had a great set at one of the clubs there, and the club owner calls him over, and he goes, I had a great set. And she goes, yeah, it was funny. But who are you? You're just another 6-foot-tall, brown-haired white guy. Nothing in your act tells me anything about who you are, what your point of view is. So that I learned in speaking and in comedy. You need to specialize, and then figure out who your ideal clients are. Figure out if you're a speaker, you need somebody who has a problem to solve that you have a partial or full answer for.
Yeah, so it sounds like any other business. You have to niche.
Yeah.
Choose your niche and understand your audience. And so, it sounds exactly like a business.
And that's what I teach my speaker marketing clients. Look, we have to figure out what your lane is, and then we have to decide who will pay you to speak on that. And I said, we should probably choose 3 to 5 ideal clients. Like I was talking to a guy yesterday who signed up for my TEDx coaching, and he's black and he's a motivational inspirational speaker. He has a motivational inspirational speech. And I said, man, that's where I would start, because as far as I know, other than Les Brown and a couple who charges who knows how much for a speech, there are not a lot of $5,000 to $10,000 black motivational speakers. So I would, for your ideal client, I would have somebody pitching every association that has the word black in it. Black bankers, black funeral directors, black car dealers, and because each one's got a national and probably a bunch of state chapters. So they'd much rather hear a motivational speech from you than from me. And I think there's
there's an affinity because they're black, the speaker's black. It makes more sense. Yeah, I gotcha.
And there are very few, as far as I can tell, black motivational speakers in that price range. So there's a vacuum there. You can fill that void and go really. Go deep, not wide. So I would start with any association, that has an annual meeting and uses outside speakers and has enough money to pay your fee. I'd start right there. The black bankers, black funeral directors, black dentists, black veterinarians.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Well, I guess going back towards the, the unhappier side of it, I guess you were kind of involved in the suicide prevention industry in a way. Like, did you volunteer for a suicide hotline, or what kind of work did you do to help other people?
That's how I make my living. Is I speak on suicide prevention as a workplace health and safety issue. I just got back from Nebraska, Montana. I spoke to the Montana Farm Bureau Federation. And because agriculture, farmers are in the top 10 at-risk occupations for suicide. It's one of the 6 occupations that I targeted: dentists, veterinarians, physicians, attorneys, construction, agriculture. They all have high rates of suicide. They all have, associations and meetings and use outside speakers. So I speak on suicide prevention. And what I go in and do is 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal are ambivalent, can't make up their mind. 9 out of 10 give hints in the last week leading up to an attempt, which tells me the vast majority of people want to live. They want somebody to notice something and intervene. The catch is, the trick is, and this is what I teach, teach them how to spot the signs of depression, thoughts of suicide, what to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say, and how to find resources. So that's the takeaways I have is this suicide prevention education. Become a mental health sort of first responder.
So what are some of the signs and what pushes people over the edge?
Signs of depression, has trouble getting up in the morning, rallies in the afternoon. Either they eat too much so they can't eat, or they sleep too much they can't sleep. And here's one you can observe actually on Zoom is they let their personal hygiene go. They're usually pretty well put together. Then they zoom in and you think, man, hair's dirty, clothes aren't quite so clean. It may be because they're having difficulty getting out of bed in the morning to run a load of wash and jump in the shower. So those are three. Now the question comes up. So what do you say to somebody you think is depressed? Well, let's start with what you don't say. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Turn that frown upside down. Have you tried fish oil? What you do say is, no, I've had people tell me that. What you do say is, look, I'm here for you and I mean it. I know you're not crazy or lazy or self-absorbed. I know that depression is a mental illness. I also know that with time and treatment, things will get better. I'll take the time. I'll help you get the treatment. And then you have to ask them, are you having thoughts of suicide? Well, let's say they're not forthcoming, but your gut tells you that's what's going on. How would you know? What signs that they may be thinking about suicide? Well, they talk about death and dying. You catch them Googling death and dying. Death and dying appears as a theme in their music, their artwork, their writing. They're getting their affairs in order. They're giving away prized possessions because they want to make sure they go to the people they want them to go to when they're gone. And here's one that's counterintuitive and I think very dangerous is they've been depressed forever. And now for no apparent reason, they're in a really good mood. They may be in a good mood because they've chosen time, place, and method for their suicide. And they know the pain is coming to an end. That's what a lot of people don't understand about suicide. Not so much often about killing yourself. It's more often about ending the pain.
So people will actually appear to be happier in the last week or last few days before they do something like that?
Yeah, because they know the pain's coming to an end. It's finite. It's not going to go on forever. Yeah, when I was suicidal, I just wanted to end the pain. I mean, I wanted to leave, and part of ending the pain was leaving my wife in a financial position where she'd be restored. So yeah, it's most often simply about ending the pain.
So did you ever volunteer for like a suicide hotline, or was that not a necessary part of the training?
No, but I have taken a number of suicide prevention classes. 2 weeks ago, I did the 3-day training to become a mental health first aid train the trainer. And I took a class this week called ASSIST, which is Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. And it's all about how you deal with somebody you suspect may be having thoughts of suicide. And I took a course called QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer. It's 12-hour training on. So I've had probably 3 or 4 suicide prevention trainings, either train the trainer or just take the class.
So what kind of useful stuff did you learn from the classes? Like, have you been able to literally help some folks not to commit suicide that thanked you later? Like, were you able to intervene with people you knew?
Every now and then I'll get an email or a DM that will thank me for, listen, Frank, I saw your presentation. I had a really bad point in my life. And you're vulnerable and you shared your story. And I just thought if he can do it, I can do it. And that was 8 months ago and I'm still here. So I get quite a bit of that.
Well, that's cool.
I get my phone number out every time I do a keynote. And I say, look, if you're suicidal, call the Lifeline. If you're just having a really bad day, call the crazy person. Here's my phone number. Yeah. And people call. A guy called last month and said, I'm depressed. I'm suicidal. We talked a little more. And what I would have been looking for in that conversation from him is called a turning point, just kind of a spark of uncertainty to find out if there's, if he's made up his mind yet.
Okay.
And he said to me, I just picked up the Amtrak schedule, which tells me that he's thinking about stepping in front of a train. And I said, look, I'm not going to ask you not to kill yourself because that's not my jam. That's not, it's your choice. I would prefer you didn't, but that's your choice. Now, I would advise you, do me a favor and don't do it on the train tracks, because when you step up on the train tracks, you're probably going to lock eyes with the engineer who can do absolutely nothing about it. You're going to take your life and ruin theirs. So everybody who does this kind of work has a different philosophy or a slightly different philosophy on suicide. Who's to say, who's to choose? Is it your life anyway?
Well, it sounds like being nice and being 100% sympathetic doesn't work. It sounds like it's a little bit of tough love, a little bit of rationalization or applying rational principles. And I guess it sounds like a mix of different strategies to help somebody. But how would you characterize it?
I think that's close. In this training, you get the story first, find out where the loss and pain is. And then, again, you're listening for those turning points, that little slice of uncertainty. And once, and it can be something as simple as, are you thinking about suicide? Yeah, I'm thinking about it. That tells me they're also thinking about not doing it. So then I say, does that mean, that if I'm hearing you correctly, does that mean, you're thinking about doing it, but that also means you're thinking about not doing it? You're not sure? If they say, no, I guess I'm not sure. Then I would say, well, what I'd like to do is, while you figure that out, if you're willing, I'd like to help you stay safe for today. Just start today. Then you come up with a plan. If there's are there guns in the house? Tell me about your alcohol use. There's a series of questions. Your little 6-way folder, a little tiny folder. It's got all the questions that you ask, are there firearms in the house? Tell me about your alcohol and drug use. Well, what would you think if you cut the 6-pack of beer every night to 2? Stopped at 2. And you get them to buy into each step they're comfortable with. Rather than tell them to do something, you get their buy-in because they're more likely to do it if they bought in.
I don't know. When you speak to people that appear to be suicidal, does it feel like a hostage negotiation? Like, are they if you tell them the wrong thing, that it may set them off, or is it not like that? Like, it seems like you're talking to them in a free way, but then again, what do you have to be careful of saying when you're dealing with someone in that situation? How sensitive are they?
Well, varies by situation. If they're standing on a railing on a bridge, you handle it one way. I would. First, I'd get out, stop the car and get out and go up to them. And I think speaking, just being yourself and not sugarcoating anything and just showing concern, but speak as I said, you're supposed to ask them, are you having thoughts of suicide? Well, let's say they are having thoughts of suicide. What do you do then? Well, you say, do you have a plan? And if they say they have a plan, then you say, what is your plan? And if the plan is detailed at time, place, and method, then best to get them on the phone with a suicide prevention lifeline, or now for younger people, because they tend to be more forthcoming in text, there's a text line, 741-741. You text the word help or connect to 741-741. Probably be somebody about your age on the other end texting back. Yeah. People always ask, when do you call the cops? Well, if they're in an immediate danger to themselves or others, you got to call the cops. If the cops come and they arrest them and take them in front of a judge, the judge will decide, should they be locked down for 72 hours? It's called an involuntary detention order.
Right.
Yep. And, it's very controversial because you're taking away personal freedom for 72 hours. But a lot of other people believe that it's a great way to just, lie down, let somebody else worry about everything else, 3 hots in a cot, basically. But what if they've got a plan, but it's not well formed? It's not really solid. And there's nothing in the textbooks about this, but a psychiatrist friend and I came up with, well, if it's a plan, but it's not really detailed, I would say, well, tell me, are you going to kill yourself? And if they say no, then you say, okay, well, then tell me why not. Make them give voice to whatever it is that's keeping them here so they can hear it out loud. They have to think about it and, hear it out loud.
And that seems to help?
Yes. The codicil is, we can't save everybody. Only 8 out of 10 are ambivalent. Only 9 out of 10 give hints. But we can save the vast. The good news is, and I usually close my keynotes with this, the good news is you can make a difference. You can save a life. And you can do it by doing something as simple as we're doing right here, and that is starting a conversation. Be brave. Be persistent. If you think something's wrong, don't just take, I'm fine for an answer.
Are there any innovations that, are in the world of suicide prevention? Anything new that's come up? Or is it just like these basic core set of skills that, once you learn them, that's the best you can do?
No, there's not in terms of the teaching. The teaching improves every year. It's updated with the latest science. There are 2 things happening, actually. One thing is psilocybin, which is a psychoactive ingredient in magic mushrooms. The Canadian government's done a great deal of research with the military, and turns out that psychedelic is extremely good on depression, PTSD, and substance abuse disorder in microdoses with therapy. And so in Oregon, about a year from now, January 1st, 2023, psilocybin will become illegal for psychiatrists to prescribe to people like me. And they think maybe it's not just a patch over the depression, it's a fix, a rewiring. The second thing that's come along in the last few years, they now have a cheek swab DNA test like Ancestry for psychotropics. So if you're depressed and your doctor gives you an antidepressant prescription and it doesn't work, then I would get the cheek swab DNA test, because they take your DNA and they try to match it with the antidepressant that they think will work best with your metabolism. So it's called precision medicine. It gets a little better every year. So those are two things. Those are two things on the horizon that could significantly bring the rates down.
Yeah, no, that's great. Have you done this swab yourself? And if so, did you figure out anything?
No, I did the first prescription my doctor gave me works very well for me.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so if it wasn't working, though, I'd have gone right straight to the swab and let them do their DNA testing and tell me what they think will work best.
Okay. Well, very good, Frank. We're just about out of time, but so for listeners that know someone that may be exhibiting these signs, or they themselves are having trouble, what's a first step recommendation for those two situations?
I would text the 741-741 Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They'd much rather hear from you, what they call upstream, where you're just beginning to struggle with these thoughts. I mean, they're certainly willing to talk to you downstream when you're on the cusp of dying by suicide, but they much rather, as you're sliding downstream, contact them early so you can begin, suggestions, resources, so game plan.
So when someone first contemplates this, how is it different from later on after they've contemplated it many times? Does it become like a rumination, or does it become a voice or an urge that gets stronger and stronger and becomes all consuming, or like, how does the path go?
Well, again, everybody's path is different. With chronic suicidal ideation, it's always there. Somebody asked me, when was the last time suicidal thought? And I said, what time is it? Oh my God. I go, no, I'm joking. It was last week. It was Tuesday. I had a really bad day. And the thought crossed my mind, hey, we can fix this. So, but now after having all those thoughts all those years, I'm so used to it now that it's just, it's like, oh, suicide. Oh, well, there's an idea. That's the benefit of being old. Is I've been through my depression cycle. It's like it's a 3-day cycle for I can't tell you how many times. So I know when I begin to slide downhill on one day, in 72 hours, I'll be flying level again. I'm used to but if you're younger and you haven't been through this a number of times, or you're simply situationally depressed by the pandemic and all its fallout, I mean, how do you know? If you've never been depressed, how do you know that it's depression? How do you know why you can't get out of bed in the morning? Those are the people I worry about, the ones that have never been depressed and all of a sudden.
Does it, going through depression cycles though, does it wear you down over time, or is it you come back and you're refreshed for the next time? I know it's a weird way to put it, but does it wear you down, or is it not like that?
It wears you down, but I've learned, I used to say I fight depression, and that's incorrect, inaccurate. Fight would imply I can win, and it's in my DNA. So I can't win. I can lose and kill myself or tie. And so there's a martial art called Aikido. And Aikido is all about blending with the energy of your opponent rather than opposing it. So I try to take an Aikido mindset, because the depression has a great energy. So rather than push back against it, I try to flow with it, and it seems to help. So it takes less energy to go with it than it does to oppose it.
How do you go with it, though? I mean, when people are depressed, do they struggle against it, or by definition, are they just going with it?
Well, a lot of people struggle against it, and they're in something of a stalemate, even physically. They just can't move. I mean, they just can't get up and get out of bed and go do their thing. What I do is there's a technique called gamification. Let's say I'm having trouble getting out of bed because I'm depressed, terribly depressed. I make a list of 6 things, a to-do list. And the game is, once I scratch off number 6, get it done, all of them done, then I don't care if it's 3 p.m, broad daylight. I can go back to bed, pull the covers over my head, and watch the next episode of The Mayor of Kingstown or whatever. So that's the game. And a lot of people with mental illness use games to get themselves moving forward. That's how I flow with the energy, is I just keep putting one foot in front of the other until.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, don't let it stop you in your track. There's inertia with motion. An object in motion remains in motion until acted upon by another force. And that's kind of how it is. You can just get up and moving forward. And
that's very useful.
Yeah, I got my list. And as soon as I scratch it off, baby, shower, take my meds, and hit the rack.
So do you feel like most of the time when you do these basic activities that the depression's gone away enough that you can still function? Or like how often do you find yourself saying, all right, I did it, I'm going back to bed?
Mostly I function until normal bedtime, because once you get moving forward, and I have a self-care plan, and I recommend that everybody have one, whether you're mentally ill or not. See, the thing about mental illness is I wake up in an uncertain world every day, before the pandemic, after the pandemic. It didn't really matter what was going on. It's uncertain. And so over time, like most mentally ill people, I developed a self-care plan. Mine is diet. I'm on the keto diet, and I eat once a day, so I do intermittent fasting. Exercise, so I exercise 5 times a week. Meditation, twice a day for about 29 minutes. It's a guided meditation, takes me down, brings me back up. So diet, exercise, and meditation. A good night's sleep is restorative, so I always get a good night's sleep. And then medication is number 5. I take a little bit of Wellbutrin. And so, but that's every day. So it's more of a routine maintenance thing. If you routinely maintenance your brain, then you're much less likely that depression is going to not be quite so deep, won't last quite so long, won't happen quite so often. But those routines also prepare you for the times when it's difficult to get out of bed, because you're in a routine.
That's good. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Well, very good, Frank. Thanks for all this. I know the interview kind of went back and forth and up and down and sideways, but I think we got a lot of good info. But thank you very much for who you are and what you do and what you bring to the world. So I appreciate you coming.
It's my passion and my pleasure.
So, Frank, you mentioned 741-741. You text help there if you're having a problem. Any other ways for people to follow up or learn more about you and what you do?
Yes, I have a website. It's called The Mental Health Comedian, or as we say down south, The Mental Health Comedian. And if you go there, co-authored 3 books on men's mental health, and I'm recording them for Audible. I'm narrating them. And the first one is on my website. If you put your email address in, you can download the MP3 for free. It's unabridged. It's a book on men's mental health, about 4 hours. And so if you have a man in your life, or you are a man and you're struggling, it's a great manual. It's book 1 of a 4-book series. But it's the only one I've recorded voice for, so I put it up there on my website for free. So The Mental Health Comedian.
Okay. Well, very good. Frank, again, thank you. It's been good.
My pleasure.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.